turns into a situation of exploitation where that migrant is then charged, held against their will. Their families are exploited back home to pay more money to pay off their smuggling debt.
So let's go back to the process. Border Patrol apprehends, processes, turns over to ICE. ICE then, again, when I was, for example, in El Paso, turns them over to an organization like the Annunciate House, who also helps allocate them to other churches to further care for individuals, but try and identify family members or relatives or some place where they can be sent to. People buy plane tickets, buy bus tickets, and these individuals are sent all over the country. Is that basically what's happening? Again, as rapidly as possible. That's occurring within 6, 7, 8, 9 days in general.
Yes, sir, that's occurring very quickly. In March, we begin releasing non-criminal process families because we were at 19,000. So we begin releasing them, working closely with our NGO partners to provide service for them after release.
Now, when you say you began releasing, Border Patrol began releasing them right, bypassing the step with ICE right into non-government organizations.
That's correct, sir. Our capacity level's at 19,000 and climbing. For the safety of our officers, our agents, and for those that we detain, we begin releasing.
So my final point is, in part of that processing, I think the migrants give you an address where they think they're going to go, correct?
Yes, sir.
But once you turn them over to a non-government organization, you have no idea where they really go.
That's correct. They're provided with a change of address form in case they go someplace else, but where they ultimately go after we release them or on an order of recognizance, we don't control where they go or how they get there.
And yet, again, the assumption is they're going to meet up with some relative. A lot of people have come in during the Central American Wars from the 80s. So there are a lot of people they know, and they've got social media, but yet we still are finding families in stash houses.
That's correct. Yes, sir.
Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know two of our members, Senator Hassan and Rosen, have a markup, so I would defer my questioning and defer to Senator Hassan.
Thank you very much, Senator Peters, for the courtesy. Thank you to Chairman Johnson and Ranking Member Peters for this hearing. Thank you to all of our witnesses for being here to testify, as well as for your service to our country. And please thank all the men and women you work with on our behalf as well. We all want to make sure that those of you on the front lines have the resources you need. We also want to make sure that you are doing your jobs consistent with American values, and I think that's something we all share. Mr. Howe, I wanted to start with a question to you. It would be great if we could have a brief update on drug seizures at our land ports of entry along the U.S.-Mexico border. Have we seen an increase in trafficking of any particular narcotic over the past 6 months?
Thank you, Senator, for the question, and thank you for visiting McAllen in May. Our narcotic seizures are on track for to match our numbers from last year. Year to date, we've seized more than 39,000 pounds of methamphetamine, which is tracking a little bit higher than normal. 38,000 pounds of cocaine, 3,200 pounds of heroin, and nearly 2,000 pounds of fentanyl.
And thank you. In particular, have fentanyl seizures increased or decreased over the past 6 months? And what does that tell you about the drug cartel's plans for the trade of fentanyl?
I think we're seeing less through our mail facilities, and it's trending up slightly on the southern border with the fentanyl.
Right. And of course, while the size of the seizures of fentanyl that you just recounted sounds smaller than the other drugs, 2,000 pounds of fentanyl is an awful lot of fentanyl, given its lethality.
Absolutely.
Mr. Hastings, how do Border Patrol's drug seizure numbers compare with CBP's seizures at ports of entry?
Thank you for the question. So we have noticed the hard narcotics generally trending up, and by what I mean specifically, cocaine seizures are up, methamphetamine seizures are up, and heroin seizures are up. Cocaine, about 97,000 pounds cocaine seized so far this fiscal year between the ports of entry. About 9,800 pounds of methamphetamine seized between the ports of entry. Heroin, 448 pounds of heroin seized so far between the ports of entry. Marijuana is slightly down at about 200,000 pounds. And fentanyl, although down a little bit at 149 pounds, still obviously very highly concerning.
Well, thank you for the information. Mr. Hastings, I want to turn to another topic. I understand very clearly from my visits to the border, the one I just did with Senators Johnson and Peter and the one I did last year, that we are facing a humanitarian and security crisis along the southwestern border. And I agree with you that we need comprehensive immigration reform in order to help relieve some of the flow of migrants into the United States. However, there is absolutely no excuse for the reported conditions at Border Patrol facilities that house child migrants. Outside lawyers recently visited a Border Patrol facility in Clint, Texas, where they reported widespread instances of children living in squalor, being denied the ability to shower for weeks at a time, caring for infants just a few years younger than themselves, and being locked in cages for the vast majority of the day. Similar reports of gross mismanagement and horrible conditions have come to light at the Border Patrol facilities at McAllen and El Paso, as well as a private facility in Homestead, Florida. I truly understand how overwhelmed Border Patrol is. I think you've done a very good job of highlighting it in your testimony. I certainly saw a great deal of it when I was down at the border just last month. I also understand that CBP needs funding to address this crisis. Hopefully, we will be able to take action here in the Senate on an emergency aid package in the coming days. However, when dealing with children, your first and foremost priority is to ensure that the children in the federal government's custody are treated with the same kind of care, dignity, and support that we would want and expect for any child. To that end, Mr. Hastings, I would like a very clear answer on these questions. First, does CBP have an obligation to provide toothpaste and soap to children in your custody, yes or no?
We're providing that in El Paso, in Clint Station.
The news reports say otherwise, but you now say you do have an obligation to do that.
We have been at the Clint Station, and generally all of our stations across the southwest border are provided with a variety of hygiene products. And even though our facilities were not constructed for the demographic
I
we're
understand
seeing
that,
today,
and my time is limited, so I'm going to cut. I do understand that you are dealing with difficult facilities. I do understand that there is a backup with HHS, which I think HHS could do more to solve. But at the end of the day, what I'm hearing you say is that you agree that children should be provided soap and toothbrush if they are in your custody, which is a different position than what the administration has been saying in court.
we are providing those things now. We have been and we will continue to.
Do you have an obligation to feed, clothe, and clean the children in your custody?
We provide 3 meals, hot meals a day, and snacks are unlimited to those in our
You
custody.
do understand that that is in direct contradiction with the news reports that we have been reading and from what lawyers who have been visiting these children and interviewing them are telling us.
And I would ask that you understand that those are the plaintiff's attorneys who have a case against the government.
And you should understand that I'm a member of the Bar of Massachusetts and New Hampshire, and I hold attorneys to very high standards, and I doubt very strongly that any attorney would be fabricating this information.
Understand, ma'am?
What steps is the Border Patrol taking right now to ensure that the mismanagement of child migrants in Clint, Texas is not occurring at every other Border Patrol facility along the southern border?
So all of the allegations that you've mentioned above that were made have all been reported to the Office of the Inspector General and will be thoroughly investigated. They've also been reported to the Office of Professional Responsibility within CBP. They will be thoroughly investigated.
I'm pleased that they will be investigated, but my question is, what are you actually doing to make sure that as you are dealing with an unprecedented number of migrant children, that you are ensuring that there is enough soap and toothbrushes, that there is enough food and enough time for them to be outside and out of very confined spaces? What I'm asking is, what are you operationally doing to change the circumstances? We are hearing reports not just from one facility, not just from 2 facilities, not just from one source, that these children are living in terrible conditions that would violate any standard of any institution that we all would expect in this country. What are you doing to actually make sure that children are getting the care and the sanitary conditions and the food that they need?
So we have done a great deal. As I mentioned earlier, we have brought in shower facilities just for this population, for others, due to the new demographic and how long we're holding them. We've increased our medical contract across the southwest border for medical assessments and medical care. We've increased, as I mentioned in my oral statement, the amount of operational funding that we're spending on consumables, diapers, food, formula, all of those things. If you walk into many of our locations on the southwest border, including Clint, you will see an area, a storeroom that frankly looks like Costco with these supplies that are available. And when agents are providing these supplies, they're documenting what they're providing. So we have those supplies readily available, and we are offering and providing those supplies now.
I am over time. I thank the chairman for his indulgence. There is a huge disconnect between your testimony and between what we are getting as reports from the facilities. I hope very much that we can just focus on making sure the children are clean, well cared for, safe, and released as quickly as possible. Thank you.
And Senator Hassan, we'll work with you to get those answers. One thing I do know that Border Patrol is doing, for example, in El Paso, instead of 28 Border Patrol agents on the border, 25 are caring for children and families, and we got 2 or 3 over that 11-mile stretch, and we're taking OFO officers from the ports of entry and also putting them on the border.
And we saw that at the border. My issue is not with how hard the men and women on the front lines are trying. My issue is what we are doing operationally to change the circumstance on the ground so that these children are well cared for and safe. Thank you.
Right. Senator Rosen.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator Peters, for deferring to our committee, and thank you for the service and work that you all do. It is difficult, it is challenging, and oftentimes heartbreaking. So we do appreciate that. And like the chairman said, we all saw that awful and heartbreaking photo of the toddler who drowned while clutching her father's neck. I can't even begin to imagine as a mother what those last moments for that father and daughter were like. And I believe the mother was on the other side of the river. And I do pray, like the chairman, that this photo and what we talk about today moves this body into action. So let's talk about the Remain in Mexico policy. According to the State Department's Trafficking in Persons June 2019 report, over the past 5 years, we know that from countries in the Northern Triangle, they're on their way to the United States. But against this backdrop, in January of 2019, DHS issued a new policy guidance on migrant protection protocols, known as the Remain in Mexico policy. Under this policy, certain asylum seekers, including families, are sent back to Mexico to wait in that country for the entire duration of their U.S. immigration court proceedings. That could take months, could take years. And so we do know that there's a challenge in federal court, but I'm concerned that this policy is going to drive more and more people into the arms of those who wish to exploit them, making the problem worse. And I can tell you that the State Department's own annual report backs me up on this. So my question to you, and I'm hoping that you can provide us the numbers if you don't have them, do you know how many individuals seeking asylum that DHS has returned to Mexico under the Migrant Protocols program policy? Any of you?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. I have the numbers for Office of Field Operations. So for the ports of entry, we've running MPP in San Diego, and to date we've returned 665, and Calexico 96, and El Paso 539, so 1,300.
And how many families were part of arriving as a family unit, excuse me?
I'll have to get back to you on that number. I don't have that.
And also, do you know the number of unaccompanied minors?
Minors would not be part of the program. They're not considered for MPP.
And to your knowledge, are there plans to expand these policies beyond San Ysidro, Calexico, and the El Paso ports of entry?
We are in ongoing discussions internally and with the Mexican authorities on expansion.
So you don't have a timeline for when?
I don't.
And you can report back to us when you do?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I also want to say that reports have indicated that DHS has returned to Mexico asylum seekers who are pregnant or children with neurological disorders. That is despite guidance that clearly states individuals with known medical issues shouldn't be subject to this policy. Have we been investigating these cases? Do you know of any?
I'm not aware of the allegations, but we generally do not include migrants that have a known physical or mental illness. If there's any criminality, a history of violence.
What about pregnant women?
If a migrant is in a long-term pregnancy or their sensitivities to the pregnancy.
Or all long-term pregnancies, or they have an end to the term, but we know the term of that.
Yes, they would not be considered.
Thank you. I have a couple of minutes. I want to go back and talk about metering at the ports of entry. Of course, again, CBP, you have a practice of metering, queue management, as you call it, at the ports of entry all along the U.S.-Mexico border, where asylum seekers are required to wait for indefinite periods for the opportunity just to be processed. Can you talk to me about why you're employing the process of metering or queue management, and is it happening across all ports of entry?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, it is. It's a discretionary balance used by our port managers to really balance and assess our mission requirements, our counter-narcotic, our facilitation of trade and travel, and the processing of migrants, and balancing our resources against that. So putting them in all those different areas and without focusing them in any one particular area.
So how can we help you, as Congress, how can we help you speed up this process so you don't have to manage this queue and you can get through?
Well, I think it's the whole process, Senator. It's our facilities that weren't designed to house large groups of individuals, and then ICRO is not in a position to be able to take them. So if we did increase, then we would be holding them longer, and ERO would have an increased difficulty in finding bed space. So it's a balance that right now with ERO and HHS's capacity issues is adequate.
So we need to have people talking to each other to increase the flow and the capacity of what we can do, and of course, to Senator Hassan's point, doing it in a humane and kind way. Can you tell me, too, the numbers quickly before I end here, how many migrants you are processing at CBP daily?
At our ports of entry? Mm-hmm. It varies across the southwest border based on that balance, as I mentioned, the discretionary balance of what we're
Can you give me a rough estimate?
300.
And do you know how many are currently in line waiting in Mexico then?
That's difficult to nail down because those numbers come from the Mexican authorities, but we've been told in each one of the areas roughly 3,000 to 4,000.
And so, based on what you know, what do you believe the average time, what do you know as to be the average time an asylum seeker will have to wait?
It's been some time since I've checked with San Diego, but what I last heard a few months ago was 5 to 6 weeks.
5 to 6 weeks. Well, I hope that, again, we can do something about this, that we can help. So many more questions we'll submit for the record about the conditions for children, young families, and we want to be sure that we stop the exploitation, because nothing in my mind is more heartbreaking. I can only imagine when you open that trailer what it did to you and the nightmares you probably have remembering that. So I want that to motivate us to do the right things. Thank you.
So Senator Rosen, because we asked a similar question, I got a response, so to get it in the record, currently as of 6/16, June 16th of this year, 11,575 individuals have been returned to remain in Mexico. 1,109 came from the ports of entry, 10,466 came from Border Patrol. So about 10% come through the ports of entry. The rest have come into this country illegally, and then they're returned. So again, the total number is 11,575. Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I want to pick up on those questions of Senator Rosen and that number. So is that the number of individuals turned away at the port of entry under the current metering practices? Just if you could give me a number of that, I want to clarify that, either Mr. Hastings or Mr. Howe.
Yeah,
How many have been turned away because of the metering process?
That's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to identify the number that are not crossing the boundary line. In many cases, the NGOs are holding them in Mexico or caring for them until there's an opportunity for us to take on more migrants. That's a communication between us, the Mexican authorities, and the NGO. So it's nearly impossible to
There are
identify.
folks coming across, and you're saying you can't come across today because of the metering process. You're saying you don't know that number?
We don't.
So, you know, obviously the tragic situation we've all talked about with his father and his young daughter. The story is that he died after attempting to seek asylum at a port of entry, and he waited for over 2 months in Mexico. What, to both Mr. Hastings and Mr. Howe, what do you think is the relationship between the metering at the ports of entry and an increase in families that we're seeing that are trying to cross between ports of entry?
Sir, I just know that, I mean, we've seen an increase in the volume of family units continue to build month after month. I'm not sure what the result is with the queue management. When we're interviewing these individuals, quite frankly, what they're telling us is we've heard on social media, or we have heard from folks who are already in the country, bring a child and you'll be set free. I mean, that's what we're hearing.
Well, that's not my question. My question is, what is the relationship? You're metering folks that are coming across the port of entry, so they can't. We know this gentleman who tragically died with his daughter was waiting 2 months and said was turned away from the metering, and so then decided to go not in a port of entry, and we're seeing more and more folks. What's the relationship of people who, if they can't come through a port of entry, they're now trying to cross at other places in the border?
I think it's difficult for me to speculate, Senator, what numbers that occur. I mean, as I said to Senator Rosen, it's that delicate balance of managing our resources at all our different mission sets. And processing migrants is important, but if we were to process more migrants, it's going to have to come from something. So it's not going to come from a counter-narcotic mission. It's not going to come from a national security initiative. So it would have to come from facilitation. And we don't want to, you know, have U.S. citizens waiting longer to return to the United States. So that balance is what we're trying to strike.
Well, we're discussing also trafficking and smugglers and the problem related to that. And so does it make sense that if it's more difficult to come across the port of entry and just present yourself at a port of entry to the legal process, and that you want to go then or attempt to get into the country a different way, that might actually increase the business for smugglers and cartels who will say, we'll take care of the situation for you, just pay us, and we'll get you in some other way? Is there a correlation there? Is there or not?
Again, I think it's difficult to speculate. We do have smuggling attempts that occur at our ports of entry. We have over 400 a year across the southwest border where migrants are either presenting somebody else's documents or they're hidden in a vehicle. So it's difficult for me to know.
Is there anything being done at the Mexican border to ensure the migrants who are waiting to cross are not being recruited by smugglers at the border or being approached to use their services? Are either we or the Mexican government engaged in attempting to disrupt that kind of business connection?
I don't have firsthand knowledge of that, but the Mexican authorities would have that responsibility.
Would we want to know what the Mexican authorities are doing, and would we encourage them to do something along those lines?
Absolutely.
Why has that not been done?
I'm sure it has been done at the local level. Where
Can we find out? Is it possible to get that information?
Absolutely.
I'd appreciate that. CBP has said that between mid-April and June 14th, over 1,800 family units were interviewed who presented indications of fraud, with 275 fraudulent families identified, is based on the data that I have. Chief Hastings, how many total migrants crossed the southern border during that time frame? I believe it's roughly over 200,000. Is that accurate?
Sir, what was the time frame again? I'm sorry.
Mid-April to June 14th. So April, June, 2 months.
April to June, so we've had a high volume, I think 132,000 last month. I can tell you for the year that we've had 5,100 fraudulent claims so far, fraudulent family claims that we know of.
Is that what time frame is that, through recent?
That's for the fiscal year of FY19.
Oh, fiscal year. So, yeah, I'm looking at a 2-month period here.
I couldn't give, I don't have that
That's fine.
specific information, but I think the biggest thing and one of the most important things is, you heard Chief Karish testify last time, it's due to the volume that we're seeing. It's very difficult to spend time interviewing and getting in depth with these individuals.
So my question also is, what do you consider, how do you define a fraudulent family? Is a grandmother and a grandson considered a fraudulent family? Or is an aunt or nephew, is that a adult sibling of a minor sibling? What is a fraudulent family?
So by TVPRA definition, it's a parent or a legal guardian, or that one that is less than 18 years old.
Parent or legal guardian. So a grandmother bringing a grandson would be a fraudulent family.
It's not necessarily counted as fraudulent, they're just not a family unit. They will be, in other words.
So it would show a non-family unit is coming across. A grandmother with her grandson or granddaughter would be considered not a family unit.
That's
based on
correct.
your definitions.
Yes, sir.
Could you give some examples of the indicators that you would use to warrant them being interviewed as a possible fraudulent family?
A lot of times we'll see just the sheer reaction between the child and the adult. The agents will see that, notice that, and they'll start questioning further to try to determine if indeed it looks like there's a true familiar relationship. We've also saw quite a bit of false documentation, specifically from Honduras and Guatemala as well, birth certificates.
Could you also describe the way the CBP officers identified the migrants that participated specifically in the DNA pilot double helix? These were not random sample of families. Is that correct? That these are folks that agents suspected as unlikely to be with a parent before you did the DNA testing?
Thank you for your question, Senator. We sent a team down to McAllen in El Paso, Texas, and the referrals were given to us after Border Patrol had an opportunity to interview those individuals. If there were individuals that they had been suspected of being in a fraudulent family unit, they would refer it to the team that was down there to conduct the DNA testing. This was after an interviews, a review of their documents, and as my colleague stated, if the behaviors did not appear to be in a familiar relationship where there seemed to be some distance between them, they used those factors to refer that family unit over for a DNA test.
I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman, but just one last question. Do you have an after-action report you could share with Congress to assess the viability of implementing DNA testing on a wider scale?
Senator, we did do an after-action report, and we will see about allowing you to see that report. Thank you.
I'd appreciate if you could get that to me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
A couple points. Those DNA tests, about $200 a test. If we've had 150,000.
Is primarily unaccompanied alien children, approximately 1,000 today, and then in addition to that, it's single adult children single adults rather, that we have in custody as well. So HHS and ERO need funding for bed space to get those out of Border Patrol custody and into the care of those who are set up for long-term detention. That's short-term. Long-term, we need a fix that quits allowing this draw for family units and unaccompanied alien children to come to the United States. We have to stop this draw.
All right. Mr. Howe?
I agree. Thank you, Senator. I agree with everything that Chief Hastings said, but in addition, just to underscore the importance of ICE, ERO to get the proper funding and bed space and HHS so that they can relieve our facilities that weren't designed for the long-term detention so we're not in this situation.
Right. Do either of you believe we need to have more border protection? I mean, so far, you talked about the supplemental and the Flores decision primarily. So what about, do we need any funding to secure the border? I mean, this wouldn't be happening if we had a secure border.
Well, right now, I think we absolutely need more funding for border security, but our biggest issue now is pulling away from that 40 to 60% of agents that we're pulling off the line to deal with the humanitarian crisis, the families, and the UACs. That's the biggest problem that we have right now. And in the meantime, while we're dealing with that demographic, a large number of single adults are still trying to evade arrest, to your point. A large dynamic of drugs as well, trying to evade. And they're using these family units who are trying to cross as a diversionary tactic in a lot of cases to be able to make money on drugs and single adults trying to evade arrest.
Mr. do you like to add anything?
Thank you for your question. we are the investigative arm of Department of Homeland Security, and the concern that we would have is the more resources we take away from conducting the complex criminal investigation, targeting the transnational criminal organizations that are actually organizing these smuggling loads and human trafficking, by putting people on the border to augment the need that CBP has, takes away potentially from conducting our mission, which is, protecting of the homeland via investigations and try to target these transnational criminal organizations.
Mr. Hastings, how does it make you feel when you get asked questions to suggest that you or your team doesn't care about these children that you're taking care of? How do you all feel every day when you get up and you read the papers or see the news where somebody suggests that you're not doing your job?
So it's disgusting to me and it's hurtful to me because daily I see our agents doing just the opposite. Yesterday, I saw our agents in Carrizo Springs jump out of the water, save a 13-year-old child who was unconscious, give him CPR, give him mouth-to-mouth, and essentially bring him back to life. That happened yesterday on our border, and that happens quite often, time and time again. Our men and women are out there risking their lives every day to save those migrants that are either put into a bad position by smugglers or put themselves into a bad position. So above and beyond that, our agents go to the maximum to care for these children. You've seen pictures on as well of our agents holding these children, trying to comfort them. So it's very hurtful for us, for our agents who are out there trying to do the best they can at securing our border and dealing with this humanitarian crisis.
How's it impact your ability to recruit and retain your team to do this job?
So our workforce is doing well right now, but they want to see a light at the end of the tunnel, quite frankly, to be able to go back to their primary national security mission. And that's what we're hopeful for, that we go back to a primary national security mission and we see legislative changes that allow us to do that quit the draw for the family units and the unaccompanied alien children.
So do you have concerns when you do your job every day that because of how much time you're having to spend because Congress won't act, that we have individuals that are crossing the border that want to harm Americans?
I'm concerned with that. I'm concerned with recruiting individuals in this current state that we're in right now, recruiting good agents to do this in the future. And I'm worried when we're diverted by the humanitarian crisis, what is coming through our border. The best example I could give is about 2 months ago, we had a large group come across in Rio Grande Valley. This is broad daylight. At the same time, we had 791 pounds of cocaine a mile away across the border in broad daylight. That tells me that there's very little fear in the minds of the smuggling organizations and the narcotics traffickers because they know we're tied up with other things. Humanitarian mission.
Anybody else?
Senator, I've been around for almost 3 decades, and I've been used to this, via my career. But I'd like to put it in perspective. Can you imagine a new agent that has just come on, that just went out and had a very successful day? They seized enough fentanyl that could kill hundreds and millions of people, or they arrested a potential terrorist suspect or a gang member, or they rescued a child from an exploitation. And they get home and they turn on the nightly news. And there's information on the news saying abolish certain agencies. Can you imagine how that agent feels? I know personally when I come home, I don't even want to watch that because it's very hurtful, as my colleague stated. So it is very hurtful, and the men and women of ICE, HSI, ERO are out there every day trying to make this country safe.
Yeah.
I'll just add, Senator, it's an unnecessary distraction. Our officers want to be mission-focused. They want to be doing what they were hired to do, enforcing our laws and facilitating legitimate trade and travel. We don't want to be distracted with processing migrants to the numbers we are.
Yeah. I've been here 6 months. I'm disgusted that we sit here and you watch on the news where people are trying to do their job get attacked and Congress sits here and doesn't do their job. It's the most disgusting thing I've ever seen in my entire career. My business career, you wouldn't do this in your business career. Thank you.
Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can I disagree with what Senator Scott just said? I mean, the behavior of this Congress is absolutely pathetic. I mean, it is just pathetic. People up here should be apologizing to you for the total dereliction of duty that this Congress has undertaken. I mean, I've never seen anything like it in my life. This is, by my count, the 6th hearing, full hearing, I've sat through in 4 months on the border, which is great. I'm glad we're paying some attention to it. The problem is this Congress never does anything. This Congress refuses to do anything. We know what the facts are. You've outlined them again today. CBP is over capacity, underfunded, undermanned. ICE, over capacity, underfunded. HHS, over capacity, underfunded. Yet this Congress will do nothing. Meanwhile, the cartels and the smuggling rings, what are they doing? They're lying to vulnerable families, exploiting children in order to turn profits and abuse our broken asylum system. And we know what needs to happen. We know we need to reform the asylum system. We know we've got to stop the pull factors as well as address the push factors. We know all that, but this Congress won't do anything. This morning I've heard, just from my colleagues across the aisle this morning, I've heard statements like, I'm heartbroken. No one is more vulnerable than a child. The status quo is unacceptable. It is unsustainable. But yet we don't do anything to change it. And there's no will to change it. Children are being exploited. This morning we woke up to the picture of the man from El Salvador and his young daughter dead face down in the water. Why? Because they were exploited. Who knows how much that poor gentleman paid to some smuggling ring who told him that if he just came to the United States to our border and claimed asylum, he'd automatically get in. That was a lie. Who knows what lies he was told? And here he ends up, he and his little baby dead, and this Congress still refuses to act. I mean, it's just, it is absolutely unconscionable. We know what needs to be done. Nobody will do it. And my view is we can talk and talk and talk, but until this Congress is willing to take some action, I mean, I'm sorry for what it is you have to deal with. I am sorry that this Congress has left you without the resources you need. I'm sorry that this Congress has not done its duty. I'm sorry that this Congress has left not only our southern border exposed and vulnerable, but has left children exploited day after day after day. And until this wretched Congress decides to do something, I don't know why we even bother to have these hearings. I don't know why it even matters, because this Congress will not act. This Congress refuses to act, and it is a complete dereliction of duty. So thank you, gentlemen, for your service. Thank you for what you're doing. And I just hope, I would just say to the President, I'd encourage the President to take every action that he possibly can within the bounds of the law to address this crisis and secure the border, because it is clear to me that this Congress will not act in any meaningful way. And so long as this Congress refuses to act, the President needs to act. And so I would urge him and urge the administration to do everything within their lawful authority to address this crisis, because this Congress is not going to. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hawley, you missed the opening when I described a process that this committee is going to undertake. And obviously the reason we hold these hearings is in the problem-solving process to lay out the reality. And so what I propose, talking to Senator Peters, and hopefully we can do this in as nonpartisan and uninflamed way as possible, but sit down at those tables like we did last week, where we passed the End Government Shutdown Act, a smaller problem, but one that, I think our legislation solved. Senator Langford's legislation, Senator Hastings' legislation, but start working through this problem in a very organized fashion, have open meetings where we discuss these things, and we talk about, okay, what do we need to do? I mean, come from a manufacturing background, continuous improvement. What can we do to start the process? Senator Peters is working right now with me, other members on the letter of support of Operation Safe Return, a pilot program where we can gather information, where we can, surge resources to, I'm not going to repeat it, but we're working on that. But I'm hoping that you'll participate. I hope every member of this committee will participate in this process, a number of meetings, hours long, where we thoroughly discuss these problems, the different elements of the problem, and start coming up with solutions. And again, I don't know if that ends up in a complete piece of legislation, or in those discussions in organized fashion, we come up with different elements that can be tacked onto a piece of legislation. So again, this place doesn't work. It does not have much of a problem-solving capacity. That's a frustration, Senator Scott, that you're certainly relaying. We all experience. And so we're going to do something different, do something paradigm-shifting. And again, whether we accomplish something or not, at least we've had a very, hopefully, thorough discussion. Senator Scott, do you want to?
I don't believe any of it.
Oh.
I sit here preside. I sit here preside this week, and I hear people from Democrats get up there, and all they do is complain about these people. They don't come up there and say we ought to fix the Flores decision. They don't come up there and say we ought to secure the border. All they do is try to embarrass these individuals sitting here. It's disgusting what they're doing. I watched it yesterday presiding, that somebody did it. For what, 15 minutes, just sit there and lambaste them about what they're doing. I mean, look, do you think, I mean, Mr. Hastings, how many people have you ever worked with that says, you know, I don't care about children. I want to do the wrong thing today.
Just the opposite. I have seen agents on their own go out and purchase toys, bring in for the children to play with. I have personally stopped by and bought meals for those that I had arrested. I've seen agents do the same thing. I've seen agents give up their lunches so people can eat. I mean, I've seen the humane professionalism and outstanding work by our agents since I've been in this agency and long before that.
So
Do
Senator Scott,
you know what they're doing today? The people that are going down the debate are going to the Homestead facility just to make news, not to solve a problem. They're not up here to solve a problem. They're up here to make, how do I make some news?
and I fully understand that. I'm as frustrated as you are with the process. I'm hoping this committee will be different. I'm hoping this process will be different. So engage in it. Let's give everybody a chance. Pardon? Again, so let's get around the table like we did last week, and let's see what we can make of this. I mean, again, you got to be tenacious. We have to start moving the football forward, or we can throw up our hands and say we'll never fix this problem. I'm saying that photograph ought to catalyze us, and we ought to try something different and start trying to solve the problem, okay? Senator Langford.
So I want to join my colleagues in the frustration of this day. And I think what we're experiencing today is some pent-up, abject, total frustration. March the 28th of this year, at that time, Secretary of DHS came to this hearing and then followed up with a letter, and this was the exact quote from her. "We now face a system-wide meltdown. DHS facilities are overflowing, agents and officers are stretched too thin, and the magnitude of arriving and detained aliens has increased the risk of life-threatening incidents." Then she said, "My greatest concern is for the children who are put at high risk by this emergency, who are arriving sicker than ever before after traveling on the treacherous trek." But instead of actually providing funding during that time period, this Congress delayed and didn't provide the funding, didn't engage, didn't try to solve it. That same secretary over and over and over again said none of this gets better until the Flores agreement settled. I've had personal conversations with Democrat and Republican members on this committee and said, at what point do we finally admit the obvious statement that the Obama administration made, that the Trump administration made, that if we don't resolve the Flores settlement, none of this ever gets better because traffickers will continue to move children across our border. But children are currently being used as pawns now on the border to try to hurt the Trump administration. And my Democratic colleagues are trying to identify children that are not getting care, at the same time slowing down the process of getting humanitarian aid to try to hurt this presidential election. These kids are not pawns, and the administration has said for month after month after month, we need additional humanitarian assistance. But here's what's happened. Nothing happened after that meeting in March. May the 1st, HHS sent us a protracted letter to try to get additional assistance and saying that we're at a crisis moment. May the 17th, they contacted us again and said we're at a critical moment. Secretary Azar from HHS came back and said at that same time period, we're at a critical moment. We tried to move a humanitarian relief package with the disaster relief package on May the 22nd, and Leader Schumer came to the floor and made this statement: the Democrats are ready to pass the bipartisan disaster relief package that's already been agreed to and written, but we should pass disaster agreement as is and return to unrelated issues at a later date. Unrelated issues is this humanitarian issue. To say these unrelated issues are slowing down our disaster work, so we'll put the humanitarian work off till later. And then yesterday, Senator Schumer was back on the floor criticizing the president and criticizing all of these folks and their agencies, saying, why aren't you taking better care of the kids? When this committee has talked about it for months, y'all have asked for it for months, and all we've got to is we'll get to unrelated issues later. Now, I'm tired of people calling my office and saying, how come you don't care about the kids? I'm sure you're tired of reading in the media every day, how come you don't care about the kids? If 500 people showed up your house tomorrow and said, I'm going to stay here for a week, would your house be ready to take 500 people? What would you do if 500 people came to your house tomorrow and said, I need to stay here? Y'all are having to manage thousands of people showing up at facilities that are not prepared for thousands of people, that never have been, and that are certainly not set up for kids. And the whole time we argue about what are we going to do when everyone knows the issue, it's the Flores settlement. Every smuggler uses that, and we won't acknowledge it, and there's been a dramatic slowdown on trying to actually get humanitarian aid. Now the Senate comes to an agreement, finally, on a humanitarian aid, and the House responds with a solely partisan bill and says, no, we're going to try to do a partisan bill. And then the conversation this week was, well, we may not get to the humanitarian bill this week if we don't get a certain vote we want on the NDAA. As Democrats, we may hold off the humanitarian bill in NDAA for 2 weeks from now. Yet another delay because it's an unrelated bill. So I don't know if we get the humanitarian vote again this week because Democratic leadership is postponing again while going to the floor and saying, why isn't the Trump administration doing more about this? You can't have it both ways. This is not about hurting the president and his presidential election hopes for next year. This is about a group of kids that we need to reduce the incentive for them to be able to come illegally across our border, and we need to take care of the folks that are already here. This is not that hard. But it's become this horrible partisan issue that I think all of us are really frustrated with, to say this has been discussed to death. We've got to be able to act on this. So I want to ask just a couple of stats. How many folks are coming across as males at this point and claiming to be 17 years old? Is there a disproportionate amount of males crossing the border and saying, I'm 17?
Sir, I don't have the exact numbers, but I can tell you that we're seeing a higher number of families with fathers as the primary, they're the primary parent that's coming across. So we're seeing an increase in fathers with children. I don't have the exact numbers with me.
How many countries have you seen crossing our border with minors?
So 140 different countries that we have seen apprehensions that we have made from 140 countries, 52 countries for family units. So we have family units from 52 different countries that have crossed into the U.S. this fiscal year.
And that is, that's just this fiscal year. So that'd be since October 1 of last year.
That's correct, sir.
82% of the people you testified people that are crossing the border are coming from countries other than Mexico at this point. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
Guatemalan authorities that I met with this week have stated that DHS has worked very hard with them, and the Guatemalan authorities are continuing to be able to work because, quite frankly, the Guatemalan authorities don't want those kids also making this trek, and they're trying to do what they can to be able to slow down the flow from their side as well. And they were very appreciative of the work that DHS has done to be able to partner with Guatemala specifically. Now, I'm sure if I talked to the Honduran authorities and the El Salvadoran authorities, they would say the same. But the Guatemalan authorities this week were very grateful to our government and the work that they're doing to be able to help not only protect those kids, but quite frankly, they want their kids back home to be able to be there. And they're a little frustrated by this whole journey as well. And as a country, we have put hundreds of millions of dollars into Central America, into the Northern Triangle for quite a while to help stabilize those governments and continue to be able to do that, to be able to provide a safe place that's there. So all of this conversation about we're doing nothing to be able to help the issues there really is we are doing a lot of things to be able to help the issues in Central America. What's not being done is deal with the pull factors here in the Flores settlement. And frustratingly enough, also not the humanitarian assistance. With that, I yield back.
Senator Portman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was here earlier and had the opportunity to hear you, Mr. Hastings, and hear some of the discussion with my colleagues, Senator Johnson, in particular on what's going on at the border, and also from Senator Peters. And I think there is now a consensus, I certainly hope so, that we're facing a crisis. It's an immigration crisis. It's also, by the way, a drug crisis. impacting my home state of Ohio and every state represented in this dais. Crystal meth is now coming in unprecedented numbers, as an example. We already knew the heroin was coming in. Crystal meth's coming in entirely from the Mexican border now, we're told. It's also a humanitarian crisis. There's no question about it. And the men and women who you represent are being put in an impossible position. And I hope that every member of this body protects the right of American law enforcement to do their job. And it's a tough job, but I think you're doing it in a professional way, and I know it's difficult. I guess what I would like to focus on is solutions. I do think there are some potentially bipartisan solutions, and I want to hear from you on it. One that has always struck me as a reasonable approach that we should be taking, which was done during the Obama administration, is to have people apply from their home country. They would apply technically as refugees from their home country because you claim asylum when you come into the United States. The criteria are the same. The criteria that have to be met are the same that are eventually adjudicated over here. We're finding about 15% of those who apply for asylum actually receive asylum. That number, may not be entirely accurate going forward, but the point is most people who are applying are not receiving it. Why? Because they're deemed through our judicial system to be economic refugees, probably, and not meeting the criteria. But what if we set up a system, as was done, again, in the Obama administration, where people, instead of being told by the traffickers, you've got to come on this arduous journey, and we're going to mortgage your house for you, and we're going to take your paycheck for the next half year, and we're going to take your kids, because if you're a kid under the Flores decision, then you can't be held in detention for more than 20 days. Instead, the traffickers had to say, you got to apply here. You got to apply from country. Now, two things would have to happen. One, we'd have to raise the cap on refugees, which has been lowered during this administration. That should be acknowledged. And it would require specifically a cap to be raised for Central American countries. Second, we have to provide the resources. Although, as you know, with refugee resettlement, primarily that's done through international bodies, including the UN, refugee resettlement operations. So this is something that could be internationalized. I've talked to a number of my colleagues on the Democratic side of the aisle about this. They haven't said no. It certainly makes sense as part of an overall strategy, in my view. The pull factor is the fact that you can misuse our asylum system now. It's also the fact that you can get a job here in America and make 10 to 20 times more than you can make in your home country. If I was in that situation, or you were, you'd be tempted to do the same thing. Doesn't make it right. So one way to do this is to have people, instead of being told you got to make this journey up north, is to say you got to apply right here. And let's adjudicate these cases. Let's provide the funding for it. Let's use the United Nations and other international bodies. Now, that reduces the flow in a substantial way. I just wondered if any of you, Assistant Director Navarro, you may have some thoughts on this, Mr. Howe, Mr. Hastings, but if you had any thoughts on this idea of going back to a system where people apply from their home country.
Thank you for your question. I'm not as versed in that area, but the argument that you make seems to make sense, and I am familiar. Back in my younger career, I actually did process refugees, and a lot of Vietnamese, Russians back in the early 90s, and it was an effective system that worked. So I could see the merits of that system and look forward to working with Congress, working with our partners, if that is something that is decided, to try that out and see if it's something that can help stop this crisis.
Yeah, and I know you're familiar with this, but the criteria you use to determine whether somebody was eligible for refugee status is the same criteria we use for the asylum status. And
yeah, it's just a difference of the section of law. I believe it's Section 207 of the INA and Section 208 of the INA is a difference, but the statutes are very similar, like you mentioned, whether they apply here in the United States or apply outside of the United States.
there's also a requirement, should somebody receive refugee status, that there's assistance provided. Usually it's through a private sector entity, but the federal government plays a role. Refugee resettlement, we're all familiar with. So it's a little different process, but it keeps people from coming up to this border. It keeps the numbers we see here, hundreds a day, thousands a week, hundreds of thousands a month, from coming up to our border. Instead, they're told, if you want to apply for this status, you got to do it back home.
Mr.
Mr. Howe, Mr. Hastings, any thought on this?
Senator, yeah, I'm very
Matter
intrigued
of
by
common
it.
sense?
I think, yeah, it's probably common sense. It reduces the pull factors. We'll let our lawyers work out the details, but if it can be done, if it's been done before and working with the State Department and our international partners, it just makes sense.
Mr. Hastings?
Thank you, sir. I would welcome anything that allows our Border Patrol agents to get back to the primary mission of securing our borders and reduces the flow.
Yeah. Your testimony earlier was striking to me when you talked about the fact that 40 to 60% of your people have been pulled off their jobs, essentially, to deal with the humanitarian crisis. I understand why they're doing it. They have to do it. We want to be sure that we're providing the emergency care that so many of these migrants need, but that's not their job. And that leads me to my final question, which is about the drug issue. When the Border Patrol is not on the border trying to detect and stop these illegal drugs from coming into our country that are killing the people I represent, that creates a whole other crisis. It's not on the border, it's in Ohio. It's in every state represented in this dais. And maybe, Mr. Navarro, you can talk a little about these transnational trafficking groups that are smuggling people, but also smuggling drugs at the same time. What can we do better to be able to detect and stop this poison from coming into our country? Crystal meth. You know, back in the day, we had meth labs in our states. People made meth in their basements or their homes, and environmental problems with that, obviously, in addition to this poison being made that was harming our communities. You don't see that anymore. Why? Because the crystal meth from Mexico, pure crystal meth, is so cheap and so powerful. I'm told by law enforcement in Columbus, Ohio, it's less expensive than buying marijuana on the streets now, and it is killing people. So, Mr. Navarro, what can we do to stop some of these drugs from coming in, and how are they related to these transnational gangs that also get involved with trafficking people?
Well, I had the opportunity to testify before your committee before about the opioid addiction in the United States, and I know you were very well aware that we initiated a border enforcement security team in the state of Ohio that I know you were present for. That's a recent occurrence that we're trying to stop the opioids flow into the state of Ohio. But our border enforcement security teams, we have 65 of them across the country. And those teams are crucial because it takes resources from state, local, and federal authorities to attack a problem. And the more border enforcement security teams that we have to tackle the drug problem, I think the better we can identify it. Also, to continue our capacity building overseas, we have trained what we call transnational criminal investigative units. We have 16 of those stationed all across the country. And all over the world, and those individuals are dedicated and our eyes and ears overseas to help provide us the intelligence, the information, and execute the laws that we don't have the authority to do so in the Central America area, in Mexico, and the drug-producing countries. So we rely very heavily on our trained partners and our transnational criminal investigative units.
Thank you for your service. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Carper.
Thanks very much. Normally we just ask questions of our witnesses. I'm going to use this as a chance to have a colloquy with two of my colleagues who I have a lot of high regard and affection for. And I might ask you a question, but I may not. But it seems peculiar to me, as I was putting together a congressional delegation earlier this year, and we looked at the flow of folks coming here from Mexico over the last, I don't know, 15, 20 years. And as you know, there are more Mexicans going back into Mexico these days than there are Mexicans coming into the U.S. And we looked at some, getting ready for our CODEL, we looked at illegal immigration numbers through the end of last October. And this was about maybe the very beginning of this year. But we looked at immigration numbers through the end of October. And my recollection was that in the previous 15 years, illegal immigration from Honduras, Guatemala, and Salvador had dropped by, illegal immigration across our southern border over those last 15 years through the end of October, it was down by just a little over 80%. And I was almost ready to declare victory. In the months since then, 5, 6 months since then, actually 7, 8 months since then, we've seen this surge, this incredible surge of illegal immigration from Honduras, Guatemala, and Salvador. What's happened with Mexico? Pretty much the same. I mean, and when I say pretty much, it's been pretty much what it was been for years. They're not surging from Mexico. They're not coming in. There's still, I'm told, more Mexicans going back into Mexico than there are Mexican Americans coming into the U.S. Why is it these three countries But we've not seen this kind of surge from Mexico. They have poverty there, they have crime there and so forth. Why aren't they coming? And there's a great need for leadership on this issue. And I think it has to come from this committee. And I've heard the chairman say any number of times, this committee has a great record of history of bipartisanship. And frankly, I think this committee attracts people who like to get things done, work across the aisle, and look to build consensus. And we really see an opportunity here. It's a very sad situation. We also see an opportunity to fix it. And I would like for us to be the committee that provides that kind of leadership. I'm not interested in pointing blame. I could easily say in response to some of our colleagues just pointed to this administration, point out all their sins. I'm not going to do that. But let's see what we can do to fix this problem. And I want to sign up to do that. And I'd say, I look at the four of us, and if the four of us can't work this out, nobody can. I mean, this is just right for our working on it. Do y'all have anything else you want to say with that spirit that I've just tried to kindle here? Anything you want to say in response to that? First of all, I just thank you all for what you do with your lives. When I was chairman of this committee, I used to go to the floor every month and talk about different units of the Department of Homeland Security and praise the men and women for the work that they do. We're just out there, Chairman and I were out there for the opening of the new Department of Homeland Security, St. Elizabeth. Was a very exciting day. But just in the spirit of what I've just said, I'd like for you guys to say something.
Well, just thank you, Senator, for what you've said and your commitment to work together to work out legislation or whatever needs to be done to address the crisis. The men and women on the border work hard. They're proud of what they do. And let's mission focus them on what they need to do.
All right, thanks. Anybody else want to say something?
Sir, appreciate it. And again, for the men and women of the Border Patrol, we would just ask for to work on the legislative fixes, please, to allow them to get back to doing their primary mission.
Mr. Lama, Greg.
I'd reiterate what my colleague says. Thank you for addressing the issue. Whatever you can do to help us out. Again, we want to focus on the transnational criminal organizations and focus on the large criminal networks that are actually exploiting these individuals. Whatever you can do to make us get back to doing that type of work and less dealing with the border crisis, we'd greatly appreciate it. Thank you very much for bringing that up.
You bet. The chairman and I have oftentimes said in this room that we have to focus on root causes. It's they're pull factors or push factors, but some of the situations we've seen in visits down to Honduras, Guatemala, and Salvador, if we were living down there, we would want to get our kids and our families out of there too. And somehow it's gotten a lot easier. It's gotten a lot easier. People used to have to walk 1,500 miles in all kinds of bad weather and danger and so forth, and they'd still do it. But now they can get in a bus and come on up an air-conditioned bus and be dropped off at the border, and a lot of people are doing it. And those, the coyotes, the folks that are running these operations, they're very entrepreneurial. They can find all kinds of ways to make money, including on the bus service business. And we got to be smart enough to figure out how to shut that down. And we can't do it by ourselves, but the Mexicans, if we're ever going to get this, USMCA can confirm that. I'm not saying that should be one of the conditions, that they work with us to shut down those buses, but that'd be part of it. There are all kinds of things we can do. The other thing I would say is we've been working now for about 3 years on Alliance for Prosperity, as you know. And it's not the whole answer. It's part of the answer. I like to say there's no silver bullet. There's a lot of silver BBs. Some are bigger than others. I think one of the big BBs is making sure that we address the root causes of why people are trying to get up here: lack of economic opportunity and hope, crime and violence, corruption. And what we're trying to do with the Alliance for Prosperity is to address all three of those. Sadly, when we look at the supplemental and the president has cut off that funding to the Alliance for Prosperity, suspended it. And when we look at the legislation, the supplemental focuses on the border and illegal immigration, we don't restore it, which I think is a mistake. So we got to be able to, I'd like to say, walk and chew gum at the same time. We got to address those root causes, and we got to address the pull factors as well. And I sign up for doing that, and I suspect my colleagues to my left would do so as well. Thank you.
Well, first of all, Senator Carper, let me say I appreciate your willingness to participate in this process, and it's going to be a different kind of process. It is going to take advantage of, I think, the nonpartisan attitude by so many members of this committee. And we've spent more than 30 hearings gathering information, trying to define the many root causes of this problem. I continue to say the primary root causes is America's insatiable demand for drugs, which has given rise to drug cartels, destroyed these public institutions. But having been a manufacturer, having solved a lot of problems, there's a process you go through, and that's what I want to see this committee engaged in. You know, not here at the dais, but down there with genuine conversations, and we do it in a very organized process, trying to address all the complexities of this, but also then trying to find, you know, the priorities. You know, what are the things that we have to fix now? You know, in the here and now, what are the longer-term solutions as well? So I'm absolutely dedicated to doing this. And it's going to be a completely different process than, you know, this Senate's been participating in as long as I've been a senator. And it's going to be genuine conversation. It's going to be, I think, senators with goodwill recognize the problem and working toward real solutions. So again, I appreciate that, and all you have to do is show up. But we're going to be holding multiple meetings, and they will go on for quite some time. And I'm just, you know how tenacious I am. With that, Senator Sinema.
Well, thank you, Chairman. You know, our nation faces a crisis along the southern border, and I'm committed to continuing our bipartisan work to strengthen border security, stop the flow of migrants to our southern border, and ensure fair and humane treatment of the migrants who do come. The situation on the ground in Arizona with our communities, our NGOs, and our border workforce is not sustainable. So I want to make sure that we're working together to develop bipartisan and common sense solutions. These solutions have to include measures that push back against the human traffickers and the criminal organizations who prey on migrants. And I'm pleased that we're having this hearing, and I look forward to our discussion. My first question today is for Mr. Navarro. According to recent data, over 590,000 migrants have crossed our borders just this fiscal year. And all along the over 2,000-mile journey from Central America to Arizona, migrants are targeted by criminal elements: human traffickers, smugglers who transport migrants through Mexico for a fee, and other criminals who are seeking to hurt these families. Of the migrants who are coming to our border, approximately how many have had some interaction with a criminal element during their journey to the United States? And how many of those migrants received assistance on their journey from smugglers?
Senator, thank you for your question. I'm not sure that anyone can give the exact numbers as far as, you know, the estimates that you're asking for. However, I would say to make that 1,500-mile journey, it's very difficult to do that on your own. And these smuggling organizations are recruiting these individuals, making false promises to them about getting into the United States, making a better life, promising them lucrative jobs when they get here. And once they get here, the traffickers take over and put them in totally different circumstances. So I will say that in order to make that journey, a very high percentage of these individuals are seeking assistance, paying upwards of $7,000 to $8,000 for that journey to make it to the border, thinking they're coming for a better life, only to be exploited once they pass, you know, the border, whether it's between ports of entry or through a port of entry.
And Mr. Navarro, regarding these smugglers who are, quote, assisting individuals to come to this country, do you have any information about how closely linked they are to transnational criminal organizations that work to ship drugs as well as people across the border?
Sure, that's a very excellent question. So what we term illicit pathways, these illicit pathways are controlled by the cartels. They're used to bring narcotics through those pathways, and they will use them to bring people. The smugglers, the transnational organizations, criminal organizations, don't care what the product is, whether it's a commodity, whether it's a person, they use those same pathways. And the human smugglers may have to pay a fee to the cartels to use those pathways to come up. But there's a direct correlation between the pathways used for smuggling narcotics as there is for smuggling persons.
Thank you. My next question is actually for all of the panel. I'd welcome all of your thoughts. It's clear to me and to many Arizonans that our nation faces a direct threat from these smuggling operations, and of course they're taking advantage of people in Central America. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about what our national strategy is to defeat this threat, and what are some of the steps that your agencies are taking to counteract these criminal transnational organizations.
Thank you, ma'am. So for the Border Patrol, again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I will say it's very hard to delve into, interview, and to follow through with getting the proper intelligence when we're just trying to get the throughput, when we are overwhelmed by the mass amount of UACs and families that are coming into our facilities, it's very difficult to take the time to delve into a smuggling case. We try the best of our ability, but we also are trying to balance that with the humanitarian crisis that we currently have. So it's very difficult, and that's why we would again ask for the legislative changes that stop this draw so we can go back and focus on the smuggling, focus on the trafficking, focus on the DTOs that are bringing thousands of pounds of narcotics into our country through the ports of entry and in between the ports of entry.
Similar to Chief, thank you, Senator. Similar to Chief Hastings, we're in the interdiction phase, so we're identifying the smuggling attempt and stopping it. I mentioned earlier, on average, about 400 criminal prosecutions on the southwest border for people that are trying to be smuggled in the United States. And so we're on that front end of it. So the back end, that investigation really is through our ICE partners to get into the details of the DTOs.
Senator, the paradigm of effective border security starts 1,500 miles out with capacity building and training foreign police officers to interdict, train them, provide them the equipment, and that's something that Homeland Security is doing to attack the problem foreign. We know that doesn't always work, and our brothers and sisters at Customs and Border Protection are the interdictors. So there's definitely a border security at our borders, but interior enforcement is equally as part of that three-prong approach to the paradigm of border security, and that is taking the pull factor, the magnet away from them by having an effective worksite enforcement strategy, because worksite enforcement bleeds several other collateral crimes. These individuals, once they get here, they know that they're promised a job, and that's where the human trafficking, the fraudulent documents, the identity benefit fraud, that's where all that happens, the false promise of a job. So it has to be a three-prong approach to effective border security.
I appreciate that. A quick follow-up question. Director Hastings, you mentioned changing American laws, which I think we could all agree is difficult in our current political climate. What I'm looking for, and really am grateful to be working with the chairman and others on this, are ways to help the administration improve the credible fear process. So that's something that we're working on to try and figure out how can we do that given the difficult partisan political climate that we're living in. But I'm also really interested in figuring out how do we disrupt these smuggling networks so that they no longer see a financial benefit and they don't see this as a smart business plan to bring groups to the United States and try to exploit the so-called loophole.
So for us and what we hear in the field, and I shared this earlier, but it is from those who we interview time and time again, frankly, what we're told is from social media or from a family member here or from a friend here, I've heard, bring a child and I'll be released within 10, 20 days. And until there is something that can address that flow, allow us to keep that family unit together, and allow us to run them through the proper cycle to allow them to have their due process and due rights, and then return them if there's no credible fear, and apply a consequence. If we're not applying a consequence, then we're going to continue to see this issue.
I'm glad you've mentioned that. That's the exact issue that we're working on to try and figure out how do we get folks and families, I'm talking about legitimate families, not the illegitimate ones that we see. How do we help process families in a timely manner to address the Flores issue while also sending a clear message back to those Northern Triangle countries that this is not an effective strategy to get into the United States of America. It's going to be difficult, I understand, but that is something that we're very interested in doing, is figuring out how do we help process families and folks faster to actually get folks back home if they don't qualify for asylum or for some other legal status of entry to our country. Mr. Chairman, I see that my time has expired.
Well, Senator Sinema, first of all, thank you for working and cooperating with me and my staff on Operation Safe Return, along with Senator Peters, so hopefully we can get that letter of support and DHS can implement that as just a first step to provide that consequence with real care and compassion. So thank you for your efforts there. I want to thank, again, the witnesses for just your service to this country. Chief Hastings, thank you for providing that example of a Border Patrol officer pulling somebody out of the river, applying CPR, saving their life. That's just an example of, I'm sure, thousands of examples of compassion the type of care that the Border Patrol, ICE, the DHS really provides people. This is, we saw passion today at the hearing, which is, that's good. It shows that the members of this committee are deeply concerned and want to get to a solution. So what'll be my job is turn that passion into commitment to actually act. So again, I want to thank all of you for your service. I want to thank Senator Sinema, my colleagues on the committee, and again, my commitment. We will start holding these meetings where we will have a genuine and robust discussion in that problem-solving process. And it will result in good ideas, areas of agreement, and possibly a full piece of legislation, or if not, elements, components that can be added to other legislation that other committees may take up as well. But this committee has led on this issue. I don't think any committee has held more hearings, gathered more information, sought to understand this problem and all its complexities more than this committee has over the last 4.5 years. And now it's time to turn that into action. And again, I think we've got the members of this committee, Senator Sinema is one of them, that really will come to that table right here in this committee room, probably starting the week after we return, and have those robust discussions to come to some agreement and start solving this problem. So again, thank you all. The hearing record will remain open for 15 days until July 11th at 5 p.m. for the submission of statements and questions for the record. This hearing is adjourned.